I've made several videos pointing to the irrefutable proof that the world we're on is definitely not a spinning globe, just like many other logical and truthful flat earthers out there on the internet land. It's really difficult for some people to even theorize that our world is anything but a spinning globe, perpetually following around the sun in an elliptical orbit because of the false picture in their mind, which makes it impossible to understand the truth, even when the truth is planted squarely in front of their face. If you simply refuse to look at the evidence which contradicts or thoroughly disproves your rigidly held belief system, then you are actually the opposite of a scientist and are instead a dogmatic religious zealot who will never consider a point of view outside of your rigid belief system. Gravity has been thoroughly disproved. The amount of gravity or downward pressure needed to keep a person pinned to the earth at the equator, where they're spinning over 1,000 miles per hour towards the east and standing perpendicular to the axis, will be a great deal of downward pressure, pinning that person to the side of a globe spinning 1,000 miles per hour, standing perpendicular to the axis. If the same person travels to the North Pole where they're not spinning and standing parallel with the axis, the downward pressure exerted on the globe at the equator would literally squash that person like a bug. I know all the retorts to this logic, which have to do with the angular momentum. Whomever rebuts this proof that gravity is a farce doesn't understand the problem I'm pointing to and should think about the problem again because they don't get it. We can show you pictures of perfectly vertical, perpendicular to the horizon buildings from over 50 miles away and 60 miles away, standing at about sea level on both sides, the observer and the skyscraper in the distance. If the world was a globe with a circumference of 25,000 miles, a building over 50 miles away should be based a full quarter mile below the horizon line and should be tilted away from your perspective since it's supposedly founded on the distant edge of a curve. People will argue that the Earth isn't a perfect sphere or we're cheating because those pics were taken from too high in altitude. But again, many such pics are taken from sea level, and if you could somehow gain enough altitude to view those buildings on a globe, they should be angled away from your perspective. People will say the angle would only be a few degrees and that the human eye cannot distinguish a perfectly vertical line versus a slightly angled line. This is the most preposterous thing I've ever heard. The human eye is so very keen, we can detect very minute angles, especially if the lines of the angles are extended out, like in a skyscraper. And also if those lines are directly near other perfectly vertical lines, all we ever see are perpendicular buildings, regardless of the altitude, vertical, and that means our world is certainly flat. A 2,500-mile flight from New York to LA is identical in duration to its return flight. This would simply be impossible on a globe with the surface constantly spinning east, especially considering the airplanes are not connected to the ground anymore. This has nothing to do with how fast the planes are not spinning prior to takeoff, nor does it have anything to do with the atmosphere not spinning 1,000 miles per hour eastward along with the ground below. It has to do with the westbound plane traveling in the opposite direction as the destination, while the eastbound plane must race against the destination and catch up. The two flights should be wildly different in duration on a spinning globe, and since their duration is in fact identical, this alone proves the world is certainly stationary and not spinning. The world's atmosphere is supposedly adjacent to the vacuum of outer space, with nothing separating the two. This is simply impossible since a gaseous body cannot exist adjacent to a vacuum without something separating the two. Now, I'm not suggesting there's a dome in the sky. Some flat earthers do say that. But what I'm saying is the infinite space model is wrong. Space is not a vacuum, but when you get up to certain altitudes above the atmosphere, the air is so thin that there's no barometric pressure at those levels to speak of. Weight is decreased as altitude is gained due to the fact that there's a gradient slide of decreasing pressure as you gain altitude. The fact that our atmosphere even exists disproves the heliocentric infinite space/globe model completely, just like all the evidence disproves it completely. Weather balloons launched 40 miles into the air will show the Earth below as flat and stationary if the proper type of camera is used and not a GoPro fisheye lens camera, which makes all straight lines appear to curve. The GoPro camera will trick the eye into believing the horizon is wrapped around a globe, or that infinite space is wrapped around a globe, depending on which direction the weather balloon happens to be rocking at that moment. A standard wide-angle lens, not a GoPro lens, will show the ground below to be stationary, and the horizon is a flat, equidistant circle all around you. People will argue that the weather balloon was traveling 1,000 miles per hour east before it was launched, and so it maintains that eastward velocity many miles into the air. This is obviously ridiculous, but we can go a step further and say it's totally illogical. If you consider the atmosphere as spinning along with the face of the Earth near the ground, if we gain altitude of 40 miles, and the weather balloon maintains its relatively fixed position in accordance with the ground below, then it must be traveling faster and faster towards the east as altitude is gained. See, it's traveling on a greater arc than the ground below would be, so in order to maintain a fixed position relative to the ground, it would need to accelerate faster and faster eastward as altitude is gained, since it's traveling across a much greater arc in the same amount of time as the ground below. Do weather balloons have rocket packs attached to them which propel them east? People will say they can see the horizon line from a weather balloon, and that means it's the end of the Earth. This is also preposterous, as the horizon line is totally subjective, meaning it affects your vision depending on where you're standing and your altitude from the ground. The horizon is simply your angle of attack on the vanishing point, where objects behind the horizon get smaller and smaller, and the horizon line in front of those distant objects simply obscures your vision beyond that point. As altitude is gained, our apparent horizon certainly increases, but the fact that the horizon line never drops as altitude is gained proves that the world is definitely not a globe. The North Star Polaris stays fixed in alignment with our North Pole all year round. This is simply impossible on a spinning globe traveling around the sun in an elliptical orbit. The Jeranism effect aside, which I'll touch on next, our North Pole is an arbitrary pointer, depending on the time of year or time of aeon. If you consider the, quote, fact that our axis is wobbling once per 26,000 years, according to the standard globe model, people will argue that it takes 26,000 years to do one wobble, so we don't see any apparent movement in the North Star. However, this is totally missing the point. The North Star supposedly maintains its alignment with our North Pole throughout the year because the North Pole star is so very far away, the Earth's motion around the sun doesn't cause any change in the parallax. My point is, if we had such a perfect alignment with that very distant North Star, the alignment would need to be very precise to keep the star fixed above our North Pole at such a great distance. If you've ever shot a scoped rifle, you'll know that the further away your target is, the more precise your alignment must be. An object as distant as Polaris would necessitate such dead-on balls, perfect alignment, that considering axial precession, we should have a new North Star every 50 or 100 years at the most. Even a 1 or 2 degree change in the axial alignment would totally and completely throw off that perfect alignment we supposedly have with Polaris. Taking this a step further, the Jeranism effect shows that the stars overhead in the winter should be invisible during the entire summer, since they're behind the sun, or would only be visible during the daytime, which is impossible. Same thing goes with spring and autumn. So the only possible way we could see the same stars overhead during all seasons, during all eons, during the sun's supposed travel around the galactic center, would be if our world is actually stationary and the celestial bodies are orbiting the magnetic center, which is fixed upon our North Pole, or better called the center of our map. Since we have also proven that NASA has been faking their footage and entering total lies undisputed and unchecked into the scientific record, and have actually been ousted by whistleblowers from within NASA who claim that they've been faking, airbrushing, and making up just about everything. Yet people will still blindly subscribe to the nonsense which the Freemasonic liars of NASA assert, in spite of their track record of being completely full of donkey poop. Finally, and these are just a few that I just mentioned, but finally, the fact that the constellations have kept all their relative shapes, alignments, and orientation for all recorded history dating back to ancient times, it really sort of disproves the Big Bang Theory in one fell swoop. Even as a globe earther for many years, I wondered how it was possible for the constellations to remain fixed in their relative positions and maintain their positioning and alignment perfectly, predictably in patterns throughout the year, if our world was actually spinning around the sun, spinning around the galactic center, which is all hurling through space over 1 million miles per hour, just like all the other galaxies. You would certainly expect to have a way different viewpoint of the stars, say, 2,000 years ago versus today. The simple fact is we can see the constellations just as they've always been in a perfectly predictable cycle, which is totally disproving the heliocentric model along with the Big Bang. Even as a globe earther for many years in my life, I realized that there was something wrong with the constellations being fixed in their alignments, but I never could quite put my finger on it. Each and every one of these verifiable facts I've just mentioned are enough alone to disprove the globe Earth model completely. Since many people are not familiar with the scientific method, including most modern scientists it would appear, I'll give you a quick refresher. Again, 1. Develop hypothesis. 2. Test hypothesis with verifiable facts. 3. If one single fact disagrees with or contradicts your hypothesis, then you must either A. Modify your model to account for the facts, or B. Discard your model altogether since it is not in alignment with the verifiable facts. That's how the scientific method works. Since the globe Earth model is the widely accepted, quote, conventional model, then the burden of proof is on the globe model proponents and is not up to the flat Earth community to disprove each and every point they feel like that jives with the model. Where in the scientific method do you see a step that involves apologizing for the facts that disprove your hypothesis, or the step which involves pointing to pretty pictures which seem to make the model a lot more fun? I'll save you some time. It does not contain such steps. So the quote rational, quote skeptical, quote scientists of the world are certainly not scientific and are much more closely akin to religious zealots who will simply refuse to look at evidence which contradicts their dogmatic religious beliefs. This would be like me as a small child catching my mom and dad doing it while dressed up like Santa and Mrs. Claus on Christmas Eve. I snapped a picture of them doing it, and they knew they were caught. So the next morning, little brother and I get up to find presents all over the place. I mean, we got everything on our list that year for some reason, and then some. In terms of presents, it was the best Christmas ever, and my little brother had the best Christmas ever to be sure. But misery loves company, so I had to let him know the truth. I showed him the picture of Mom and Dad dressed up like Santa and Mrs. Claus getting freaky on the couch next to the tree, and I told little bro, dude, Santa isn't real. It's just Mom and Dad lying to us. They're the ones who put the presents under the tree. And look, the to from information on the presents is even in Mom's handwriting. See? But little bro really loves the idea of Santa Claus and tells me to shut up. I don't know what I'm talking about. Look at all the presents. If Mom and Dad were Santa Claus, then we'd have Christmas every day, right? So little brother calls me a liar because he knows Santa is real. They even talk about spotting him on the news, and they wouldn't lie. This analogy can be perfectly applied to the scientists who really love the idea of a globe Earth, but simply refuse to consider the evidence which is contrary to their long-held dogmatic belief. Even the scientific types will ignore the evidence and expect the flat Earth community, for some reason, to fully disprove Santa Claus in their mind. So instead of showing them the picture of Mom and Dad, along with Mom's handwriting on the to and from on the presents, they expect us to disprove Santa's beard, his belt buckle, and his red nose, and his hat as well. So we need to disprove each and every reindeer. We need to disprove Mrs. Claus, right down to each and every button on Santa's red jacket. With all due respect, this is the opposite of science, and by disproving even one single fact surrounding Santa Globe is sufficient to disprove the entire thing completely. We do not need to prove each and every button on the red jacket as false, nor do we need to go down the list of reindeer and disprove them individually either. Yes, Rudolph was also a shill, and his red nose was bullshit as well. This is inherently unnecessary, even according to the scientific method, as if we can disprove the Santa phenomenon as a whole, Rudolph and his nose go with him. Thank you. On the internet land. It's really difficult for some people to even theorize that our world is anything but a spinning globe, perpetually following around the sun in an elliptical orbit because of the false picture in their mind, which makes it impossible to understand the truth. I've made several videos pointing to the irrefutable proof that the world we're on is definitely not a spinning globe, just like many other logical and truthful flat earthers out there. Even when the truth is planted squarely in front of their face. If you simply refuse to look at the evidence which contradicts or thoroughly disproves your rigidly held belief system, then you are actually the opposite of a scientist and are instead a dogmatic